The excavator's steel teeth ripped through concrete like tissue paper. 23 years of family memories crumbling into dust and debris. Derek Sullivan wiped sweat from his forehead as chunks of his kidney-shaped pool scattered across the backyard where his daughter once learned to swim. But through the billowing cement dust, he spotted her, Patricia Whitmore, HOA board president, standing rigid at his fence line with her phone pressed against her ear, that predatory smile spreading across her Botoxed face like poison ivy. Yes, this is an emergency. I need police and code enforcement at 1427 Maple Ridge Drive immediately. Illegal demolition in progress. Possible property damage to neighboring homes. What Patricia didn't know was that Derek Sullivan had spent 18 years writing the very building codes she was about to weaponize against him. The pool was just the opening move in a chess game she didn't even realize had started. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that seemed determined to make your life miserable, or faced someone who used their tiny bit of authority like a weapon, you'll understand exactly why what happened next felt so satisfying. Sometimes the people who think they hold all the cards discover they're playing against someone who designed the entire deck. Derek Sullivan stood 6'2", with the weathered hands of a man who'd built half the subdivisions in Riverside County. At 46, he'd transitioned from swinging hammers to managing municipal construction projects. But muscle memory died hard. 3 months after the divorce papers were signed, he'd decided the pool had to go. Too many ghosts floating in chlorinated water. Lisa had taken Emma to Portland, claiming the California schools weren't good enough anymore. Though Derek suspected her new boyfriend's tech job had more influence on that decision than educational standards. The Willows Creek subdivision had seemed perfect when they'd bought the house 8 years ago. Manicured lawns, underground utilities, covenant-controlled harmony. What Derek hadn't anticipated was how the homeowners association would evolve from neighborhood beautification committee into a miniature totalitarian state, with Patricia Whitmore as its self-appointed dictator. Patricia had moved in 4 years ago with her investment banker husband, immediately running for the HOA board with promises to elevate property values and maintain community standards. Within 6 months, she'd orchestrated a coup against the previous president. A retired teacher who'd been content to focus on genuine issues like street lighting and playground maintenance, Patricia had bigger ambitions. Under her leadership, the HOA had instituted paint color pre-approval requirements, mandatory landscaping inspections, and a 3-strike violation system that could result in legal action against homeowners. Derek had managed to avoid Patricia's attention for 3 years by keeping his head down and following the rules. His lawn stayed regulation height. His garbage cans disappeared within 12 hours of pickup, and his exterior paint remained within the approved earth tone palette. But divorce changes people, and grief makes you care less about neighborhood politics. The first citation had arrived 2 weeks ago, hand-delivered by Patricia herself with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Outdoor equipment violation, she'd announced, pointing to Emma's abandoned bicycle on the front lawn. Percovenant section foura. Recreational equipment must be stored in garages or designated storage areas. Derek had wanted to explain that he couldn't bring himself to move the bike, that seeing it there made him feel like Emma might come racing around the corner at any moment. Instead, he'd simply nodded and wheeled the bicycle into the garage. The second citation followed 3 days later. Landscape maintenance deficiency. The sprinkler system had been acting up, leaving brown patches in the front yard. Derek had been dealing with bigger problems than grass color. But Patricia treated lawn imperfection like a personal insult. Property values? Derek, she'd said, clicking her pen against her clipboard with mechanical precision. We all have a responsibility to maintain standards. Now she stood at his fence line, documenting his pool demolition like a prosecutor gathering evidence. Her manicured fingernails tapping against her phone screen as she spoke to whatever authority figure would listen to her complaints. Derek knew exactly what she was doing because he'd seen this playbook before. Patricia didn't just enforce HOA rules. She weaponized them. Any neighbor who crossed her found themselves buried under an avalanche of citations, violations, and legal threats until they either conformed or moved away. The police cruiser arrived first, followed closely by a white pickup truck with Riverside County Code Enforcement stenciled on the door. Derek continued operating the excavator, finishing the last section of concrete before shutting down the engine. He'd known this moment would come. Patricia was too predictable. too drunk on her tiny bit of power to resist the opportunity to humiliate him publicly. Officer Janet Crawford emerged from the patrol car, a 20-year veteran who'd probably responded to more HOA disputes than actual crimes in this neighborhood. Behind her, Code Enforcement Officer Mike Torres consulted his tablet while Patricia gesticulated wildly, pointing at the destruction in Derek's backyard like she was reporting a war crime. "Mr. Sullivan?" Officer Crawford approached the fence line, her voice professional but weary. "We've received a complaint about unpermitted demolition work. Can you tell me what's happening here?" Derek climbed down from the excavator, pulling off his work gloves as he walked toward the gathering crowd. Patricia had positioned herself slightly behind the officers, close enough to interject but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability about orchestrating the entire confrontation. "Removing my pool?" Derek said simply, "It's my property." "Actually, sire," Torres spoke up, consulting his tablet. "Any demolition project involving structures over a certain size requires permits and inspections. Pools definitely fall into that category." Patricia stepped forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "Officer, I've been documenting this illegal activity for 3 days. He's created a safety hazard with concrete debris flying into neighboring yards, and there's been no attempt to follow proper procedures." Derek studied Patricia's face, noting the flush of excitement in her cheeks, the way her pupils dilated slightly when she talked about violations and procedures. This wasn't about safety or property values. This was about power, pure and simple. Patricia had found her calling as the neighborhood's enforcement arm, and Derek's personal tragedy had given her the perfect target. "Mr. Sullivan, do you have permits for this work?" Torres asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No," Derek admitted. "I wasn't thinking about permits when I started." Patricia's smile widened fractionally. "Officer Torres, what are the penalties for unpermitted demolition? I assume there are fines involved?" Something in her voice, that eager anticipation of his punishment, flipped a switch in Derek's brain. For 3 months, he'd been operating in a fog of grief and anger, making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. But Patricia's obvious satisfaction at his predicament cleared away the mental haze like a cold shower. "The fines can be substantial," Torres replied, "ranging from $500 to $5,000 depending on the scope of the violation. Plus, all work has to stop until proper permits are obtained." "How long does the permit process take?" Derek asked, though he already knew the answer better than Torres did. "Could be 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the complexity of the project and whether environmental assessments are required." Patricia practically glowed with triumph. "Officer, what about the mess he's already created? Those concrete chunks have been landing in my yard for days." Derek watched Patricia savor her moment of victory. I saw the way she stood just a little straighter as she delivered what she clearly considered a killing blow. What she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Derek Sullivan had spent the last 18 years not just following building codes, but writing them. He'd served on municipal planning committees, consulted on zoning regulations, and helped draft the very environmental protection statutes that Torres was now quoting. "I understand completely," Derek said, his voice suddenly calm and measured. "I'll make sure to obtain all proper permits and follow every regulation to the letter. In fact, I think I'll be doing several other home improvement projects as well, all perfectly legal." "Of course." Something in his tone made Patricia's smile falter, just slightly. Officer Crawford was already walking back to her patrol car, clearly recognizing a civil matter when she saw one. Torres handed Derek a citation and explained the appeals process. But Derek wasn't really listening. He was watching Patricia's face, memorizing the exact moment when her expression shifted from triumph to uncertainty. As the officials departed and Patricia retreated to her house, Derek pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in 2 years. When the familiar, gravelly voice answered, Derek smiled for the first time in months. "Tommy." "It's Derek." "Yeah, I know it's been too long. Listen, I need a favor. How would you like to make some easy money while completely screwing over my HOA president?" Tommy Ricci arrived at Derek's house at exactly 7 a.m. the next morning, his battered Ford pickup rumbling to life in the driveway as the neighborhood was still shaking off sleep. At 61, Tommy was built like a bulldozer, short and thick with forearms that looked like they'd been carved from oak. He'd been Derek's mentor when Derek first started in construction. And there wasn't a building code, zoning regulation, or municipal ordinance in the county that Tommy couldn't quote chapter and verse. Jesus. Derek, Tommy said, surveying the demolished pool. You really went scorched earth on this thing. Derek handed him a steaming cup of coffee. The morning air crisp with the promise of another scorching California day. I wasn't thinking straight. Lisa had just finished the custody paperwork, and I needed to hit something. Tommy nodded with the understanding of someone who'd watched too many good men get destroyed by divorce lawyers. So what's the deal with this HOA queen? Patricia Whitmore. She's been gunning for me since the divorce started. But yesterday she made it personal. Derek pulled out his phone and showed Tommy the photos he'd taken of his property after the officials left. Look at the fence line along the back. Tommy studied the images, his weathered face creasing into a frown. Son of a bitch. She's got at least 2 feet of her fence on your property. Maybe more. That's what I thought. But here's the real kicker. Derek swiped to another photo. Look at her deck extension. Tommy's eyes widened as he examined the image. That overhang is definitely violating the setback requirement. City code mandates 5 feet minimum from the property line for any permanent structure. He looked up at Derek with growing admiration. You sneaky bastard. How long have you known about this? About 18 months. I've been letting it slide because I didn't want neighborhood drama while Emma was still living here full-time. Derek's voice carried a hard edge that Tommy had never heard before. But Patricia just declared war. So now we're going to show her what real warfare looks like. As if summoned by their conversation, Patricia appeared at her kitchen window, koffiemoog in hand. Watching them with obvious suspicion, Derek waved cheerfully, and she quickly stepped back from the window. She's paranoid, Tommy observed. Good. Paranoid people make mistakes. Derek pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. I need you to do an official property survey. Completely legitimate. By the book. Then I need you to file complaints with the city about her violations. Tommy flipped through the paperwork. Property deeds, city planning documents, building permit records, going back 15 years. Derek, this is thorough. I've had a lot of sleepless nights since the divorce. Gave me time to research. Derek's smile was cold as winter. Patricia wants to play the rules game? Fine. But she's about to learn that I helped write the rule book. They spent the next hour walking Derek's property line, Tommy taking precise measurements with a professional surveyor's tool, while Derek documented everything with his phone camera. Every few minutes, they'd catch sight of Patricia's curtains twitching as she tried to spy on them from different windows throughout her house. Derek, Tommy said as they worked, I gotta ask, you sure you want to go down this road? Once we file these complaints? There's no backing down. The city doesn't mess around with property line violations. Derek thought about Emma's empty bedroom, about Lisa limiting his visitation rights. He thought about Patricia's predatory smile yesterday, the satisfaction in her voice when she'd called him reckless and irresponsible. He thought about all the sleepless nights listening to her landscaping crew's 6:30 a.m. leaf blowers, her passive-aggressive notes about trash cans being visible too long. I'm sure, he said, at exactly 9 a.m. Tommy knocked on Patricia's front door. Derek watched from his kitchen window as Patricia answered, her face shifting from annoyance to confusion to growing alarm. As Tommy explained he was conducting a property survey. I don't understand. Patricia's voice carried across the yard. Why do you need to be on my property? Ma'am, according to county records, part of your fence and possibly your deck are positioned on Mr. Sullivan's property. We need to establish the exact property line. That's ridiculous. We had our property surveyed when we bought the house. Tommy consulted his clipboard with practiced professionalism. That would have been 4 years ago. Correct? Property markers can shift over time due to soil erosion, weather, and ground settling. Mr. Sullivan has the legal right to verify his property boundaries. Derek could see Patricia's hands trembling as she processed the implications. If her fence was on his property, she'd have to move it at her own expense. If her deck violated setback requirements, the city could force her to tear it down entirely. This is harassment, Patricia said, her voice climbing toward hysteria. He's doing this because I reported his illegal demolition yesterday. Ma'am, this is a routine property survey, Tommy replied. his tone professionally neutral. Mr. Sullivan is well within his rights. If you'd prefer, we can request the city surveyor instead. But that process takes several weeks and costs significantly more. Derek watched Patricia's face cycle through emotions: anger, fear, calculation. She was intelligent enough to realize that fighting the survey would only make her appear guilty, but not experienced enough to understand how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. Fine, she said finally, but I want to witness every measurement. Of course. Ma'am, that's absolutely your right. For the next 3 hours, Patricia followed Tommy around both properties like a suspicious cat, questioning every measurement, demanding to see his credentials, photographing everything with her phone. Derek made a point of working in his garage with the door open, occasionally wandering out to offer Tommy water or ask pointed questions about the survey results. How's it looking? Tommy? Derek called out during one of these exchanges. Finding anything interesting? Tommy glanced meaningfully at Patricia before responding. Well, the fence line is definitely problematic. Looks like approximately 26 inches on your side of the property line. And that deck. He shook his head with theatrical sadness. Whoever built that didn't check the setback requirements properly. Patricia's face drained of color. That can't be right. We paid for professional installation. Ma'am? I'm just documenting what's here. These measurements don't lie. Tommy showed her his clipboard. The deck extends 4 feet 2 inches from your house, and the setback requirement is 5 feet from the property line. Your actual property line runs 3 feet 6 inches from your house foundation at this point. Derek did the math quickly in his head. Patricia's deck was violating the setback by nearly 10 in casa, significant violation that could result in forced demolition and substantial fines. This is insane, Patricia said, her voice cracking with stress. We can't possibly tear down our deck. We just had it refinished last summer. That's between you and the city planning department. Ma'am, Tommy said gently, I just measure and report. As Tommy packed up his equipment, Derek joined them in the backyard. So what's the final verdict? I'll have the official report completed by tomorrow morning, Tommy said. After that, it's up to you what you want to do with the information. Patricia stood frozen beside her violated deck, staring at the orange spray paint marks Tommy had used to indicate the actual property boundaries. Her perfectly controlled world was cracking apart, and she could feel the foundation shifting beneath her feet. Derek, she said suddenly, her voice different smaller, almost pleading. Can we talk privately? Derek studied her face, seeing genuine fear where arrogance had lived just hours before. Of course. Patricia, what's on your mind? She glanced nervously at Tommy, who was loading his truck with deliberate slowness. I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot yesterday. Maybe we can work something out. Neighbor to neighbor. Derek nodded thoughtfully. Maybe we can. But Patricia. He stepped closer, dropping his voice to just above a whisper. Next time you want to call the cops on someone, you might want to make sure your own house is in order first. The remaining color drained completely from Patricia's face as the full scope of her situation crystallized. She'd started a war with someone who possessed superior firepower, better tactical knowledge, and the patience to let her destroy herself. And the worst part was, he hadn't even deployed his heaviest weapons yet. 3 days later, Derek was enjoying his morning coffee when he heard shouting from next door. Through his kitchen window, he could see Patricia in her backyard, gesticulating wildly at a man in a hard hat who kept shaking his head and pointing at various parts of her property. His phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. City inspector just arrived at Patricia's. Phase 2 is officially underway. Derek stepped onto his back patio to get a better view. The city inspector, a heavy-set man named Rodriguez, whom Derek had worked with on several commercial projects over the years, was methodically documenting every violation Tommy had reported. Patricia's husband Richard had apparently been called home from his investment banking job. BMW sedan sat parked awkwardly in the driveway, and Derek could see him through their kitchen window, pacing frantically while shouting into his phone. Mr. Sullivan? A voice called from his front yard. Derek walked around to find a young woman with a clipboard standing beside his mailbox. Jennifer Park, City Planning Department. I'm here about your pool demolition permit application. Perfect timing, Derek said, smiling warmly. Would you like some coffee? This might take a while. As Jennifer documented Derek's property for the retroactive permits, they were joined by 2 additional city employees, an environmental assessor and a neighborhood impact coordinator. Standard procedure for pool demolition. But Derek had timed the application perfectly. Patricia's property was crawling with city officials, and now his was too. To any observer, it would appear that the entire block was under some kind of comprehensive municipal investigation. Jesus Christ. What the hell is happening over there? Richard Whitmore appeared at the fence line. His tie loosened, and his face flushed with stress. Derek, what are you doing? Derek looked up from the demolition site plans he was reviewing with Jennifer. Hey Richard, just getting some permits sorted out. How's your morning going? You know exactly how it's going. Richard's voice was tight with barely controlled rage. The city inspector says we have to tear down our deck and relocate our fence. That's $15,000 minimum. Possibly more. Wow. That's rough. Buddy. Derek's tone was sympathetic, but his eyes remained cold. Maybe you should have had everything properly surveyed when you built those improvements. We did have it surveyed. Richard snapped. By a licensed professional. Licensed by whom? Jennifer Park looked up from her paperwork. Professionally curious. Richard faltered. We. It was 4 years ago. I'd have to look up the company. Derek already knew the answer because he'd researched it thoroughly. The Whitmores had used Richard's brother-in-law, who called himself a property consultant, but wasn't actually licensed to conduct legal surveys. It had been cheaper than hiring a real surveyor. But the measurements were legally worthless. The thing is, Richard, Derek said conversationally, when you're making permanent improvements to your property, you really need to ensure compliance with all regulations. I mean, what if someone got injured because of an improperly constructed deck? The liability issues alone could be devastating. Richard's face cycled through several shades of red. Are you threatening us? Of course not. I'm just saying that as neighbors, we all have a responsibility to follow the rules properly. Derek turned back to Jennifer with renewed interest. Speaking of which, how's the environmental assessment looking for my retroactive permits? The impact should be minimal since the pool has already been removed. Jennifer replied, consulting her notes. We'll need to verify that proper disposal procedures were followed for the concrete debris, but assuming everything checks out, you should receive permit approval within 2 weeks. Derek saw Richard's expression darken further. 2 weeks to resolve his illegal demolition. While the Whitmores faced months of legal battles and tens of thousands in reconstruction costs. Richard! Patricia's voice called shrilly from their backyard. Richard, get over here. This inspector is talking about violation fines. Richard shot Derek one final furious glare before stalking back to his collapsing kingdom. Derek watched him go, then turned back to Jennifer with genuine curiosity. Jennifer, hypothetically speaking, if a neighbor wanted to file frivolous complaints about my permitted work, what would happen? Well, they'd need to demonstrate actual violations of city ordinances or permit conditions. She replied, as long as you're following approved plans and staying within regulatory guidelines, there's not much they could do. She glanced toward the Whitmore property, where voices were getting progressively louder. The city takes false complaints very seriously, especially when there's a pattern of harassment. Multiple frivolous reports can result in substantial fines for the complainant. Derek filed that information away for potential future use. Over the next hour, Derek watched the situation next door deteriorate completely. The inspector had discovered multiple violations beyond the fence, and deck issues their storage shed was positioned too close to the property line. Their air conditioning unit violated noise ordinances, and even their mailbox encroached 6 inches into the city's right-of-way easement. But the real knockout punch came when Rodriguez discovered Patricia's prize-winning rose garden. The elaborate irrigation system she'd installed last spring ran directly under the property line, with sprinkler heads extending 18 inches into Derek's yard. That alone constituted trespassing and water rights violations, carrying potential fines of $5,000. Ma'am, Rodriguez explained patiently as Patricia clutched her pearls. You'll need to completely redesign your irrigation system and relocate these plantings. The city takes water rights very seriously, especially during drought conditions. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Derek noticed curtains twitching as residents emerged to walk dogs or check mailboxes. hoping to catch the unfolding drama. The Hendersons pretended to garden while eavesdropping. Even old Mrs. Chen positioned herself on her porch with tea. The irony wasn't lost on Derek that Patricia, who had spent years documenting her neighbor's every minor infraction, was now the neighborhood's main source of entertainment. 3 years of her tyrannical HOA presidency had made her plenty of enemies, and Derek could practically feel the collective satisfaction radiating from the gathered onlookers. By noon, Patricia was sobbing openly in her driveway, her perfect composure finally cracking under the weight of public humiliation and financial catastrophe. The final confrontation came that evening. Derek was cleaning up the last debris from his pool demolition when he heard footsteps on his driveway. He looked up to see Patricia approaching alone, her eyes red-rimmed and her usual perfect composure completely shattered. "Derek," she whispered. "Please, can we talk?" He set down his rake and gave her his complete attention. "What's on your mind?" "Patricia? You know exactly what's on my mind." She wrapped her arms around herself despite the warm evening air. "The city says we're looking at $35,000 in fines and reconstruction costs. Richard is talking about remortgaging the house." Derek nodded sympathetically. "That does sound expensive. Please." The word emerged cracked and desperate. "I know I was wrong to call the police on you. I know I overreacted. But this is destroying our lives." Derek considered his response carefully. For a moment, he felt a flicker of sympathy. Patricia looked genuinely broken, and there was something pathetic about watching someone who had been so petty and vindictive reduced to begging in his driveway. But then he remembered Emma's empty bedroom. He remembered Lisa's cutting words about his unsafe environment. He remembered the satisfaction in Patricia's voice when she'd called him reckless and irresponsible. "Patricia," he said finally, 3 days ago, you stood in this exact spot and smiled, while a police officer wrote me a citation. You called me reckless. You tried to use my worst moment against me because you thought you had power over me." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "But here's what you didn't understand. I've been building things and following city codes longer than you've lived in this neighborhood. When you decided to weaponize the rules against me, you picked a fight with someone who helped write those rules." Patricia's shoulders shook with silent sobs. "The difference between you and me," Derek continued, "is that when I broke the rules, it was because I was grieving and not thinking clearly. When you broke them, it was because you were too arrogant and cheap to do things properly. And now you're learning that actions have consequences." He picked up his rake and turned back to his work. "Oh, and Patricia, I've decided to build a workshop in my backyard, 20 by 30 feet, 16-foot ceiling height, to positioned exactly 5 feet and 1 inch from your property line. Construction starts Monday at 7 a.m. sharp and should take about 6 months. I'd invest in some good earplugs if I were you." Patricia's face went ashen as she realized the implications. 6 months of construction noise starting at dawn, blocking the sunlight to her precious rose garden for most of the day. "Derek, please, the permits are already approved," he said without looking up. "All perfectly legal. Of course, I learned from the best about following regulations properly." As Patricia stumbled back to her house, Derek allowed himself a moment of genuine satisfaction. Through his kitchen window, he could see her collapsed on her couch, phone pressed to her ear, probably calling their lawyer or mortgage broker. Richard paced behind her, his hands running through his hair in desperation. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't just legal, it was absolutely poetic. If you've ever dealt with someone who used their authority to make your life miserable, you know that feeling when karma finally catches up with them. And if you're facing your own HOA nightmare, remember that knowledge is power. Patience is a weapon. And sometimes the best way to win the game is to make sure you know all the rules better than anyone else.